Hey darts fans, that's Timo Newman here, the transporter. Welcome to the good ship Undarted Waters, and this is the third video in our voyage, the 3 darts, and today we're speaking about our third dart of a visit. Now my third dart of the visit there went into the bull, but it was actually a little bit lucky because it kind of I was trying to do a little bit of a narrative about 3 darts, the first dart missing, the second dart close, and the third dart bang on target. But the second dart hit the bull, and the third dart was actually going a little bit off, but got pulled in because of grouping. So we can't ignore the fact that grouping is actually behind the scenes in this conversation. That whatever our brain and body is doing with our 3 darts, as once the dart has left our body, the 3 darts still interact with each other because of touching, and you get grouping effects and so on, or blocking. But anyway, I want to today just carry on our discussion from the previous video yesterday, where I spoke about the first dart and completely contrast what's going on with the first dart to the third dart. And the reason we're doing the third dart next is because I think it's almost the opposite of the first dart. And then we'll look at the second dart in the next video, which is kind of a weird hybrid of the two. So without further ado, let me get the whiteboard. And what I've left on here from the previous video is actually the diagram of the dart player's brain. And I'm just going to put another light on. Actually, it's quite dark. I don't know if that will help a little bit. Yes, so this is the dart player's brain. And I'll just quickly go through it again. And what I've left on here is what's going on in the dart player's brain for the first dart. And then we can correct this and discuss, well, how are things changing with the third dart? So just very briefly then, we have the actuator. This is the part of our brain that actually just is the kind of the, what do they call it? The go decision, like there's no going back, you throw the dart. So that activates the muscles to throw the dart, and that's the outside world. Dart has gone. This is the visual cortex, so feeding into the actuator is what we see. There's 2 different kinds of muscle memory, long-term muscle memory and short-term muscle memory. And then this sensory box here is just our internal sensing. So our vision is kind of our external sensing, and S is our internal sensing about how did it feel to throw that dart. And with the first dart, this is just not activating essentially, and that first dart is being driven by our intrinsic muscle memory with aiming from the visual cortex. We look at our target, say the bullseye. As I mentioned, very important for the first dart, the dartboard is empty. So we always see the same thing with every first dart. You know, crudely speaking, every first dart is the same visually because the board is empty. And we take aim, feed that into the actuator, muscle memory, throw the dart. So now let's see, how would this be different for the third dart? So imagine now that we've thrown 2 darts, and just for the simplicity of argument, let's say that we're aiming at the same target, like I was there for the bullseye, or what you would normally do where you'd be, say, aiming in a 501 game in the scoring phase for the treble 20 or the treble 19. So we're not switching, because that's a more complicated thing. We're looking at the same target. Well, first of all, we don't have an empty board. We don't have a blank canvas here. So what's feeding into the visual cortex is, for the third dart now, is a board plus 2 darts. Okay? So this is already something we have to really think about, that we are looking at something unique that we've never seen before. Because the first 2 darts will be in certain positions that have never been exactly replicated by us before. So the visual cortex is doing a lot more work. It's much busier on the third dart than it was on the first dart. It was almost switched off for the first dart. It was just saying, yeah, there's a dartboard. I want to hit the bull or the treble 20. You know, that's where I have to look at to aim. But there wasn't much computation going on, but now there's a lot of computation going on. Okay, we'll speak a little bit more about that in a few minutes. So I will take the word aim away from here, and I'd like to replace it with the word calibrate. Okay. Again, we're aiming at the same target. Okay, so it would be different if we were switching around the board, but I want to use the word calibrate there. That's feeding into the activator. Another way to think about this would be to say that on the first dart there was an absolute aim, and on the third dart there's a relative aim. So we're aiming at that target relative to where the first two darts actually landed. Okay, and I think we all recognize this as darts players. If we're aiming for that treble 20 and the first two darts, whether they're in the treble or not, whether they're maybe to one side or above or below, we recognize that what we're doing on that third dart is we're calibrating. We're looking at a relative aim. I want to go slightly lower than that previous dart, or slightly to the left of that previous dart. So it's not an absolute aim, it's a relative aim. And just for the sake of language, I'll call it calibrate. So we're going to calibrate. So that's what's going in to the visual cortex there. Now for the first dart, as I mentioned before, it's long-term muscle memory feeding in. But this is going to switch now. I said there may be a small amount of short-term muscle memory if you've had a recent visit, if you're not playing a very slow player. But in normal conditions, let's say that the short-term muscle memory would be kind of weakly feeding in on the first dart. There's some kind of lingering memory of what was happening, say 30, 60, 120 seconds ago. But on the third dart, we're talking about 10 times faster timescales, what happened a few seconds ago. Okay, so the main input in terms of muscle memory is short-term muscle memory, very, very strong. It's the feeling that we all know on that third dart in particular, that you're kind of in a mini flow of that visit. Okay, and if it's going well, that's a very buoyant feeling. It's a very good feeling. And the long-term muscle memory is probably there in the background, okay, but what's dominating is the short-term muscle memory. And this is a feedback loop here. So basically from the first and second darts, when we threw those darts, we had internal sensation of all of those muscles in the arm and in the grip, maybe even in the back. Possibly even in our legs as well, if there's a slight amount of movement, or we're trying to use our leg muscles to keep very steady. All of that's feeding in, and so we have a feedback loop then. So this, oh sorry, wrong way around, feedback loop. So the first and second darts were sensed after they were thrown. That fed into our muscle memory as short-term muscle memory, and then feeds back in to the actuator. I'm just going to get rid of this nasty blob here because that's quite ugly. Let's just make that a bit more neat. There we go. Right. So a very important principle that was completely absent on the first dart is this idea of a feedback loop. Okay. So first, second darts were thrown. We have the sensation of that. That feeds into our muscle memory, and that actually then is input to the next dart, a feedback loop. And we have another feedback loop here with the visual cortex of those first two darts are feeding in to the visual cortex. There's computation going on, there's calibration going on into the activator. So I think one of the most important things that I'd like to really stress with the end of the visit is that feedback is happening in two different types. One is internal feedback of sensory kind of computation of our muscles, and the other is visual feedback, calibrating what happened to our previous two darts and adjusting, calibrating to that. Okay, and that feedback, both kinds of feedback, were completely absent on dart 1. All right, so these are most of the main differences then. I think the last thing I would like to just say about the third dart, though, is that there's also something with this computation of the visual cortex that I think we might call adaptation. Because like I've mentioned a few times, on that first dart, you're looking at something you've seen thousands of times before, an empty board. For the third dart, there are two darts sticking in that board in positions that have never occurred exactly before. So it's not just a matter of like the visual cortex having to kind of compute something. I think it's actually having to adapt to something new. Whenever we see something new, we have to kind of adapt to it. You know, like if you walk into a room that you've walked into many times before, but you get a strange feeling when you walk into that room, it's because something has changed. And in your unconscious, your visual cortex picks that up in your unconscious and it gives you a feeling. Maybe there is a rat sitting in the corner of that room, which is very, very scary. It wasn't there before. You've never seen a rat in that room before. It's sitting in the corner. How did it get in? What on earth is it? I would scream. I'm going to confess, if I saw a rat in the corner of the room, I'd probably scream just involuntarily before I then went and got a broom and shooed the bloody thing out. Okay, blooming thing out. Sorry. That's just me though. Maybe other people would be a bit more stoic. Okay, but that adaptation is a very important thing for our survival, that we adapt to new visual stimuli, but it's very intense, computationally intense. So I think what this is kind of indicating is that even though we may think that we're kind of more in a flow, that doesn't mean that things aren't going on in the mind. The mind is really busy. It's soaking up huge amounts of information from our body and from the dartboard ahead of us in terms of the calibration and the adaptation. And so maybe something to kind of take away from this is that flow is increasing as we go through our visit. And so if things are going well, we're in a very good flow state on that third dart, but unconsciously there's a huge amount of computation going on. And this, this is why we get tired when we play darts. If you play darts for an hour practicing, it's really tiring. And even though physically maybe it's not a huge amount, mentally it's very, very large. And non-dart players would not appreciate that. But I remember reading that for the very top grandmasters in chess, when they're playing the classical chess, which has basically very generous time limits, some games will go on for 6 or 7 hours. And I read that a chess player may burn up to 1,000 calories over those 7 hours, because for 7 hours they are staring at the board and their mind is just computing. So don't underestimate, or we should not underestimate, how much energy the brain uses when it's computing, whether it's conscious or unconscious. Okay, it'd be like someone who's in a very dangerous situation where they're having to be extremely alert for an hour would be exhausting, because the brain is on full alert, and again the visual cortex and also the hearing and other senses are very alert to changes, and this adaptation process is going on. So maybe, is there just one last thing I want to say about the third dart? What I would say about the third dart is what often happens is that if you start to get removed from the flow state, meaning that the consciousness starts to reintrude, because you're very conscious, the consciousness is dominating on the first dart. It starts to die down as you go through your visit because of this kind of flow, all of these feedback loops. You're more in this so-called flow, which it maybe is another way of saying unconscious computation rather than conscious computation. But if you let your consciousness intrude, we all know this, that things can go quite awry. Okay, so people often say this about getting a 180, particularly someone who's not gotten a 180 before. They might have very many times had the first 2 darts in the treble 20, then consciousness intrudes. It's like, I'm going to get a 180, devastation, right? Because the dart will go anywhere. But there are other ways that consciousness can intrude, and I think for a more experienced darts player, maybe who's not worried about what the score is, maybe they don't care if it's a 140 or a 180, they just want to get a good score. But a different kind of thing that can intrude is a feeling of comfort. It's almost like consciousness saying, I'm really happy, I'm in a flow. So instead of like, oh no, I've broken the flow. It's like I'm really happy I'm in the flow, but that's actually just as bad. So even consciously recognizing the flow state, what it leads to, I think, is laziness. And I think basically these inputs to the actuator get interrupted, and you have what's called the lazy third dart. And I think we've all experienced the lazy third dart, where it's like, oh, I've got to stay relaxed, I'm in the flow, it's going well, and then you actually throw like an inch or 2 inches low because you allowed your consciousness to dictate what flow means, and consciousness has no idea what flow means. It's purely unconscious computation. So I don't know how to rectify that lazy third dart. Somehow we just have to trust. I guess it comes down to trust. Trust our body, trust the brain. The dart player's brain is very sophisticated. 2 feedback loops operating, feeding into the actuator. Leave A alone. Let A just get on with its job. That's what we have to do. We can't tell ourselves to do that because, of course, that breaks the flow, ironically. But we have to, I think, at the start of our visit, have faith in the visit, that we know we're going on a small journey, dart 1, dart 2, dart 3, and that journey, as I'll talk about in the final video of this series, takes us from 8 characteristics which all get flipped by the time we get to the third dart. There's all this flipping going on, okay? From aiming to calibrating, from focus to flow, from long-term muscle memory to short-term muscle memory, to very boring visual stimuli to very complex visual stimuli that require adaptation and so on. Lots of things are sloshing around all at the same time in that 20 seconds of the visit. Okay, and we just maybe have to have faith, and I think that's where practice comes in. If you practice well, you know, ideally say an hour a day, if you have the time to do that, your muscle memory will get very, very strong. Your visual computation of darts will get very, very sort of trained. The adaptation will be an easier process, and you can have more and more trust in yourself. Okay, so I hope that's helpful. That's dart 3. And in the next video, we'll turn to the pesky second dart, okay, which is some kind of weird hybrid of these 2 darts. So until then, 3 darts at the oche. I hope you're all doing well, and I'll see you next time. All the best.